أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا محمد وآله الطيبين الطاهرين وأصحابه الغر الميامين. Alhamdulillah, thank you so much for joining us for another post-Khutbah conversation. This khutbah was particularly amazing and passionate and very timely and unfortunately very singular, as I don't think that we've heard many khutbahs like this ever. And I think that we're at a particular juncture in which sectarianism has reached an all-time high. Perhaps even it's now worse than it was in the early 2000s when tensions boiled over in Iraq. And I don't think that we are beyond those days. I think that those days, and the Sheikh may agree with me, I don't know, could be ahead because the benefit of what happened in Iraq in the early 2000s was clearly favored Israel's position in the region and America's also position in the region. Nonetheless, it's a hot topic and a divisive one, but an important one, which is why I think we decided that having a conversation about some of the particulars of what was said to elucidate further was necessary, also given the fact that Trump is now in office, a ceasefire deal supposedly has been reached, could be flimsy, given the fact that the one in Lebanon is also very flimsy. The 60-day mark has been passed, and Israel is not abiding and has not been abiding by the terms of the ceasefire. So looking ahead, what can we expect? That's what we hope to get into in this conversation. So Sheikh, thank you so much for this khutbah. There was a number of points that you raised, and why don't we jump into the really main one, the concept of Ummah. You know, you raised this idea of that an Nabi al-Ummi, or being an Ummah or Ummi, that designation for the Prophet has to do with one of leadership and has to do with one of falling under the guidance of the leadership of this Imam, so to speak, and how this shows up in the Quran. And we spoke a little bit earlier, you and I, about this concept of typically the way that the umminess of the Prophet is brought up in theological discussions tends to focus on the fact that the Prophet was an unlettered, uneducated man, and thus that is a proof for his miraculous reception of the revelation. Do you want to further talk about these proofs as the main function of how it's understood, and this, not novel necessarily, but this less pronounced understanding of Ummi?
Yeah, it is. It's not novel. There are others who have reached the same conclusion that An-Nabi al-Ummi, as referred to in the Quran, is not underscoring that he is illiterate or unlettered, simply because of the fact that literacy, the ability to read and write, was a small percentage of the population at the time actually could read and write, and it wasn't anything special. It wasn't proof of anything, that the fact that because you're illiterate that you would lack eloquence. There were many poets that were highly eloquent, very gifted, that were not literate, that could not read and write, but yet their poetry was remembered and celebrated. And so that is, it's a point that was celebrated, I think, by insecure people who are, in terms of apologetics, are insecure about proving the prophecy of the Prophet. What An-Nabi al-Ummi refers to is the very concept of an ummah, is that you are the very idea of an ummah and the very notion, like the idea of an is not. Why do we refer to a mother as a Because not because the mother is an administrative leader. That's not what an is, or even an imam. The role of an as in a mother, or imam as a leader, is refers to the symbolic world that you have in your mind an ideal. So your mother is an ideal. And when you revere your mother, you listen to your mother, you respect your mother as an ideal, as a construct. And the same thing with an imam. It's an ideal as a construct. Now, what is the ideal? What is that construct supposed to represent? It is supposed to represent your submission as a people to one God and the final prophet of that God, to Muhammad alayhi salatu wasalam. So al-Ummah al-Muhammadiyya, al-Nabi al-Ummi, that you are the leader of this nation. And that's why Allah says that you are an Ummah, and your function as Ummah is to bear witness, and your prophet bears witness unto you. Why? Because that's the leader of this Ummah, Ummah al-Islamiyya. But it's very critical that when you go back to the Prophet coming down from the Ghar of Hira, right? And that's where the Muslim Ummah starts. I mean, it starts after the Muslim Ummah is a continuation of the Ummah of the Prophet Ibrahim alayhi salatu wasalam. But in its final statement, Al-Ummah al-Muhammadiyya, when the Prophet comes from Ghar Hira and he has received the revelation, and at that point, he has a program. There's a program. And the program that he has is a revolutionary one. And the revolutionary program is that I will stand up against disbelief in God. I will stand up against all types of hedonisms. I will stand up against all types of dilutions and rejections of the supremacy and the sovereignty of God. And in this revolutionary program, I stand for justice, and that's why Qist is emphasized repeatedly. And I stand for a balance of rights and duties, al-mizan. That's the revolutionary program. He's not coming in to be another emperor. He's not coming in to be another king. He's coming in to replace an unjust order with a more just order. And so, and intuitively, you see this repeatedly when there are rulers that come and go. And, some rulers are more just than others. Some rulers are lousy. Some rulers are better. But the anchor, the compass of the Muslim Ummah remains the same throughout history. They know, the people that document the story of the Muslim nation know when there is injustice, when there is persecution, when there is suffering, when there is a foreign invasion, when there is an external enemy that persecutes a part of the nation. And regardless of what rulers do, the nation is constantly responding, saying basically, we are one. So part of being an ummah is that you don't think of just me or my tribe or my territory. You are thinking of the whole. Your accountability, when you see yourself as who are you accountable to, you're accountable to all Muslims. And that's critical for the idea of an ummah. Now, the biggest challenge that we confront are, and this is quite purposeful, by the way, because in the history of colonialism, the entire history of colonialism was to come in and try to do everything to obstruct that unitary passion, that impulse, that we are one, and our purpose is one, our goals are one. So they've created Sykes-Picot, they've created the State of Israel, they've did everything possible to encourage dictators like Ataturk in Turkey to hype up Turkish nationalism as opposed to any type of pan-Islamism. Same thing in Albania with the infamous Hoxha, the dictator of Albania. Same thing with various Arab states. When colonialism furthers the Arab Revolution in order to defeat pan-Islamism, it is critical to understand that colonialism sees any form of pan-anything as a danger, whether it's pan-Arabism, pan-Kurdism, pan-Persianism, whatever it is. But the biggest danger of all, the one that they cannot abide, the one that they impulsively react to as an inherent source of danger, is pan-Islamism. And that's the Ummah, basically. So what do you do? I mean, I heard this somewhere, and I don't remember where, that there was someone in the State Department, and I forgot his name, unfortunately. But one of the, it was, I think, like Undersecretary of State or something like that. Someone was commenting about the Iran-Iraq war and saying to this guy how the Iran-Iraq war is such a tragedy because all these people are dying. You know what I mean? 1 million people lost their lives in this war. And it was an entirely pointless war. I mean, other than the fact that Saddam saw himself as a proxy, as basically waging this war in order to, because his bosses wanted to defeat pan-Islamism and the threat of pan-Islamism. So this guy he was saying, oh, what a waste, what a tragedy. And the fellow, who I sort of remember was an Undersecretary of State, commented, it said, the real tragedy is that this war will come to an end someday. And that statement is tells you everything, that we want anything that defeats the possibility of pan-Islamism. When you see the way that the divide between Shia and Sunni, we went from, in the 1930s, and the Dawat al-Taqrib, which was basically an effort for theologically to recognize to come together as Shia and Sunni, and to recognize the obvious, is that what we share is far greater than what we disagree about, and far more important. And back then, the Ja'fari madhab was recognized as a fifth madhab, and the Zaydi madhab was recognized as a sixth madhab. So it was, even Azhar declared that the Ja'fari was a fifth madhab, the Zaydis were a sixth madhab, and later on they went even further and said the Ibadi was a seventh madhab. We went from this to this impulsive, irrational antipathy between the Sunnah and Shia. This was not happenstance. This was engineered. I mean, and engineered to do exactly what we saw happen in the war in Gaza, where we see a group of people responding to the suffering of Palestinians and saying, this is not just their fight, it is our fight. In a word, they responded like you would expect the Europeans to respond if you attack one of them, or responded in the way that the Americans would respond if you attack one of the American states. If you attack one of us, you've attacked all of us. The success of sectarianism is to get Muslims to look at this response and say, oh, no, this is a Shia thing, not a Muslim thing, but a Shia thing. What greater? So at the same time that you are basically poo-pooing this response by Arabs, because I mean the Yemenis are Arabs, the Iraqis are Arabs, the Lebanese are Arabs, the Syrians are Arabs. At the same time, you're poo-pooing that response. You yourself, as Sunnis, and this is the biggest danger, you are deconstructing and undermining the very theology of an ummah. Why is that? Because you're Emiratis, you consider anything that is pan-Islamic to be a danger. And as Emiratis, you basically act like a colonizer. Your policies are indistinguishable from the policies of a colonizer. If there's pan-Islamism anywhere, we're going to fight it. Because what we are about is business and money and making dollars, basically. If you are Saudi, you focus on your identity as a Saudi and say Saudi Kubra or the greater Saudi, whatever that means. And you say what Palestinians are going through is not our problem. And what a genocide next door is not our primary concern. And we are not obligated to use any of our resources to defend our fellow Muslims. See, Egyptians, the theology, again, is extremely dangerous because you're saying what takes priority is my treaty with a colonizer, with Israel. And because of this treaty, not only will I tolerate a genocide, but I will actually participate in the genocide. When you take the net result of all of that, nothing remains of the notion of a Muslim ummah. It doesn't exist anymore because you have basically an Egyptian ummah, a Saudi ummah, an Emirati ummah, and each of them acts like an isolated island. And here is the thing, which is countries that dominate our world, the economies of France, of Germany, of the Netherlands, of Sweden, of the United States, of England, obviously, even the economy of a country like Japan. These economies were built on centuries of colonial domination. They became what they are because they dominated and exploited the other. Now, the rules of the game that were set by the colonizer, the nation state, each nation state on its own, no matter what the Egyptians do, no matter what the Syrians do, no matter what the Saudis do, they will never, not in hundreds of years, ever get to the point of being able to be at par with the colonizing states, with Germany or France. Why? Because they will never be colonial powers. The very logic of their borders basically dooms them to this, in terms of power, and dooms them to a inferior status So they will always remain developing states. It will never change. The only way, the only path for anything to ever change is pan-Islamism, is to basically recognize we've got to come together. What I don't have, you can help me with. But so you are, the rules of the game, basically, it's like you're playing a game where you will remain the losing party forever. And that's why, the optimism of the 50s and 60s about developing states, when we look back now and we see that the story is a story of failure. None of the developing states became developed. Not in any way to compete with the powers that dominate our world.
Right.
But it is because the rules of the game are fixed. That aspiration of, we are a developing state and we are working to become all you are doing is working to become like the tourist attraction for your former colonizers. But the only way that you can maintain your sense of safety and security is basically to become a proxy, a client state of your former colonizer. So, I'll play the game. I will pursue policies that you like. I will never independently look at what interests need to be served as a Muslim Ummah. In fact, I will put way in the back burner the idea of an Muslim Ummah, and I will just focus on basically being an Ummah that is an extension of the West, or an extension of Russia, or an extension of China, although China really doesn't have many states are an extension of it. It's a very different dynamic. It's a losing game. But the heart of the defeat, where you get to the point where it became very clear that there's no path forward, is this Shia Sunni thing. Because can you imagine what this region would be if the Turk, the Persian, the Arab could all come together in some unified pursuit of common interests as Muslims? Can you imagine what would happen to this globe? And it is naive and frankly silly to think that those who dominate Muslims and make sure that they remain a dominated client status, it is naive to think that they don't see that. They know that the worst thing is for Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and Iran and Turkey to come together. So, and you are not going to go and occupy Egypt, Turkey, and Iran. The United States occupied Iraq, and it was extremely costly, and occupation is a very messy thing. So what you do is you make sure that you have leaders that act basically as an antidote that will prevent, under any circumstance, any type of pan anything. And that's why, for instance, you find Sisi of Egypt, after his coup, immediately, although Egypt doesn't have a history of antipathy between Shia, but immediately Iran becomes an enemy. And regardless of what Egyptian national interests could be, or leave alone Muslim national interests could be as an ummah, but Iran, why is Iran an enemy? Because those who back up Sisi becoming president say, these are the rules of the game. You are never to allow the concept of an ummah to emerge. So I think any talk of decolonialism that doesn't start with confronting these basics, which is core to Quranic ethics, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَلَا تَفَرَّقُوا, don't break apart into divisions, and don't become Shia, don't become sectarian parties. And you ignore that, and you basically say, oh, yeah, I know God says this, but I will use the liberties of my own circumstance to basically put that command on the back burner and not confront it as a real challenge, like you would confront a weakness within. You just simply set it aside. Any talk of decolonialism that doesn't start by confronting the major lines of division, it's like you're talking about decolonialism, you want to restore some ideal in mind. That ideal has to start with the notion of an ummah. So you have to confront what divides and forces this ummah apart. And a major source of division is the Sunni Shia divide, plus the irrational nationalisms that, we have to confront the reality that, for instance, the role of Khurasan, Iran, in Islamic history. And what can we conceive of Islamic history without Khurasan? You can't.
Right.
You can't conceive of Islamic history without the Turks, without the Kurds. When you talk about Islamic history, you talk about the legacy of the Islamic Ummah. If you try to limit it to an Arab factor, or a Kurdish factor, or a Turkish factor, or a Persian factor, it doesn't work. You will go nowhere. A very critical point that I didn't talk about in the khutbah. When you a lot of Muslims think that the way that they can reclaim the Ummah, Islamicity, is by going back to the Salaf, right? But if going back to the Salaf is a modality of simple imitation of external factors, it's a failed project. Because the Ummah was never about your beard or your turban or your hijab, or it was never about any of these external appearances. Right. That's not what defined an Ummah. What defined the Ummah is whether it's like when you read the travels of Ibn Khaldun, whether he was in Cairo or he was in the heart of Africa, or whether he traveled to, or you read the travels of Ibn Battuta. You find what defines the Ummah is wherever he goes, he finds Muslims who take as a for granted conclusion that their imam, their boss, is Allah and the Quran and the Sunnah of the Prophet. Now, they manifest this in enormous varieties, and I wish Muslims would read Ibn Khaldun and read Ibn Battuta to see how much variety existed. But this basic backbone ideological commitment that you hail from Egypt, and we are a very different culture, but there is a happiness and there is a sense of familiarity when I see you, And he talks about how warmly he's received and welcomed. Why? Because people say, "Oh yeah, your fellow boss, your boss and me, my boss are the same. Both of us, our boss is Allah and the Prophet." And that's what, when that becomes secondary and you put it on the back burner, and suddenly what defines us is, I am, my master and majesty is the king. My boss is the president of Egypt. My boss is Assad of Syria. We were destroyed. It's gone.
Right.
Nothing remains of that ummah. That's, I see this as the most critical challenge that confronts Muslims, and what they need to think about in for their future generations.
So a question here arises. You demarcated and delineated the difference between nations and their people, meaning governments and their people, and that the governments keep the people trapped and hostage in a sort of way. And the real sovereignty that belongs to the citizenry of that nation is usurped essentially by the government, as they don't represent the will of the people per se. But then you also see Muslims who are critical of the despotic regimes in Muslim lands, so to speak. So those same Muslims will argue that, there's a few camps. One camp will argue on the basis of rigid theological, Salafi da'wah kind of type of thinking of, nobody is part of the Muslim Ummah unless they meet our categories of aqidah and dogma and belief, which isn't, that's kind of a modern aberration. But if we go to kind of like the more mainstream Ahl Sunnah kind of ideology and theology, it's like you mentioned, you alluded to Sheikh Shaltut's very famous fatwa, and there was also a meeting back in Jordan in the early 90s, or I can't remember exactly when it was, and they established the schools of thought. But one will look at Sunnah and Sunnis who make the argument that I would love for Shia and Sunni unity. In fact, 2006 was a great time for the possibility of Shia and Sunni unity, as Hezbollah successfully defeated Israel and drove them out of Lebanon, or the early 2000s when they they liberated the south of Lebanon, or even back into 79, where many Sunni movements, so to speak, I wouldn't say leaders, but were excited at the prospect of an Iranian leader who had sympathies to the views of Sayyid Qutb and Maududi and kind of the pan-Islamist thought process. And there was clearly a momentum that was taking place here. And the Iranians very clearly also, I think it should be stated here, it seems to be as a matter of belief preceding the revolution, with thinkers like Mutahari, who were very famous, gave sermons that imparted upon the Iranian people that they must, in every shape and form, whether it means giving just a single dollar whenever they can spare it to the Palestinian cause. And this far precedes Hamas and a lot of the organizations that now are in the resistance movement. But back to the point that I was making, the governments versus the people. Some people may say, I'm critical of Saudi Arabia as a Muslim. I'm critical of Egypt, and I'm far aware that Turkey maybe didn't do as much as it maybe could have. You said they didn't recall their ambassadors, but they say that I would be happy to engage with a Shia unity back in 2006, but not in the 2010s, because what we see in the 2010s is the support of Hezbollah and Iran for a leader like Bashar al-Assad, or the argument that the unrest and the terrible unending war that took place in Yemen really was stoked by the sectarian tensions imposed upon the Ansarullah or the Houthis, being that they're, of course, they're Zaydi, they're not exactly 12ers, they're not 12ers, but that this really was an Iranian move to counter Saudi Arabia's regional power and influence. And the building of the Shia Crescent began to take form. Iran, did not adequately oppose America, and in fact helped America or allowed for America to take Afghanistan and to position a Shi'i-dominated government in Iraq, which then led to potential claims of Shi'i colonization of Iraq and sectarian cleansing, an ethnic cleansing of Iraq, and a input of Shia in districts within Iraq or within Damascus, for example, or in places like Homs. And these are many different things that are leveled. We're talking about the nitty-gritty. It would be great for I, as a Sunni, to aspire towards Shi'i Sunni unity, but as Sheikh Qaradawi, may Allah rest his soul, said, perhaps I owe an apology to our friends in Saudi Arabia, as he once said very famously, as he was pro-Shia Sunni unity, given all of this that we just said. But after seeing what happened in Syria, it seems that I was the one that was in the wrong, and I should have paid heed to the warnings of our brothers in Saudi Arabia. What do you make of this? Because that isn't the government anymore. This is the belief of many Muslims that the Shi'i movement, revolutionary fervor in the region, really was a medium or a modicum for Iran to assert itself as a regional nation-state power.
Listen, I understand this argument, and I understand the whole. It's people intellectuals that even I respected, like Ridwan al-Sayyid, who started saying, "Oh no, there's this Shi'i Crescent threat to so on and so forth." But we need to pause, and it's like an in-house conflict. No in-house conflict can take place without the various participants in this household being at fault. And so it's like a hand clapping. You need both hands to clap. And so if we can break this down at a variety of levels and analyze it. What you perceive as a threat, it depends on what interests you define for yourself. So does anyone seriously take the proposition? Let's assume that, in fact, it's true that Iran exercised influence in Yemen, exercised influence in Iraq, exercised influence in Syria, exercised influence among Shia populations. Does anyone take seriously the proposition that the purpose was to somehow convert the Sunni world to Shiism? Even if it was looking for allies and partners among Arabs in Shia populations, was it in somehow an existential threat to Sunnism? I think that's absurd. It wasn't an existential threat. At most that you can say is that, and then you go back to the question, why did Iran think it needs to have allies in the Arab world? Well, Iran is isolated, literally a state under siege, it would be irresponsible for Iran not to try to find allies. And if Sunnis have closed their doors and said, no, you're Persian, we are not going to be allied to you, it doesn't surprise me that then they would try to find ally. And especially when you find that a place like Yemen, the very aggressive imperialist moves taken by the Emirates in a place like Yemen, which puts Iran in a position, well, what's going to happen to the Zaidi population? But there's a critical point, another point. What Hezbollah is not representative of the Shia everywhere. What I'm talking about is that you have a group that is as old as Islam itself. They coexisted from the very beginning. They were there. And it is not a small minority. It is a minority in the millions. And so theologically, when you have millions of Muslims tell you, this is my system of belief, it is irresponsible for you to simply say, you're apostates. You're not a part of the faith. Theologically, that's a huge problem. I mean, that is why, again, from a jurisprudential point of view, why is it that among Muslims never exterminated the Druze, for instance, or never exterminated? If the Druze existed in Europe, that's European solution was extermination. Every minority, theological minority that emerged in Europe, what happened in the Reconquista and Andalus took place all over Europe. It was just simply exterminated to the last man, woman, or child. In Islam, that didn't happen. And it didn't happen because of the Sharia injunction that you simply cannot exterminate people who hold a ta'wil, an interpretation. And that the fact that they have an interpretation obligates you to do tawaqquf, to suspend judgment.
Right.
And this was throughout Islamic history. And that's why we have all types of even groups that I and you might consider quite extreme in terms of their belief, but they were never exterminated. When you say, I don't accept the Shia as Muslims, what you are saying is, I want them exterminated. Yeah. That genocidal thinking is a grave sin. And if a Shia says Sunnis are not Muslims, that's, again, genocidal thinking. That genocidal thinking is a grave sin. And it is an imposture in Islamic jurisprudential thinking. It's a colonial imposture. Because look at the history of Islam. We've never exterminated minorities. Never. Even minorities like the Baha'is that were clearly an apostasy from Islam. Even places like Ahmadis where there were all types of persecution and so on. But extermination was never a solution. And we forget that that's a part of the heart of an Islamic ethic, and that Europe or other cultures, extermination was a very viable solution. So that's another point. But further point, and this is really important, what happened in Syria was a civil war, and civil wars are dirty and messy, and both sides in a civil war commit atrocities. That is not to excuse atrocities, but what that is to say, every person who committed an atrocity should be held responsible. everyone that committed a rape, everyone that killed civilians, they should be arrested and tried. Whether they are part of Hezbollah, whether they are part of Jabhat al-Nusra, whether they are part of the armies of Assad, I don't care. You've committed a crime. And you've committed the crime of Hiraba in Islamic Sharia.
Right.
Because you've raped and pillaged and stole and murdered. I wonder if the response to the Hezbollah, if we know that unfortunately Emirati money and Saudi money started supporting a lot of the Syrian opposition. And part of the Emirati and Saudi money was, you must be sworn enemies of Shiism,
right,
and sworn enemies of Iran. I wonder if the Syrian opposition would have said to Hezbollah from the very beginning, listen, our problem is with this tyrant, Assad. We want to overthrow Assad, but we give you a commitment that arms, supplying you, Hezbollah, with arms and supplying the Palestinians is not going to be affected.
right.
Basically, we commit ourselves in the same way that after the revolution in Iran, the first thing that Iran did was expel Israeli diplomats and give their quarters to Palestinians.
Mm-hmm.
Basically said, you get out, come Palestinians, take their offices.
Right.
If the Syrian opposition would have made clear that we are not into the Shia Sunni thing and we're not fighting Assad because he is Alawi, or he's actually Nusayri, not Alawi. But anyway, but we want to get rid of a tyrant. I wonder to what extent that would have changed and challenged things. The problem in Syria, and I'm not defending, I personally, it's clear why Hezbollah thought that, well, we need to defend that supply route. And we need to defend the supply route because we see those who are rebelling against Assad, and by the way, there's a lot of evidence that there was no love lost between Hezbollah and Iran and Assad, that they didn't exactly like each other. But anyway, the thinking was, we have to defend this route, supply route, because if it's cut off, then we will not be in a position to resist Israel as a fighting force. We will not be able to maintain our strength that we displayed in 2006. And in fact, this even affects Hamas and the Palestinian resistance in general. And so it is not a surprise that now there are a lot of Syrians that say Hezbollah committed atrocities. And my response is, absolutely everyone that committed an atrocity should pay for their crime. Should be tried. And if found, pay for their crime. And I don't care what they belong to. But to take that strategic decision, right or wrong, and to use it to condemn, to endorse genocidal thinking, i.e., all these millions of Shia are not Muslim. Well, if you're saying they're not Muslim, so what do you propose to do about them? And to even adopt what to me is an obscenity of thought. That is to say, the Shia are more dangerous than the Zionists.
Right.
The Zionist is a colonial entity planted by colonialism in the heart of the Muslim world in order, it's like Biden said, if Israel didn't exist, we would have to create Israel. Why did Biden say that? Because Biden knows that the whole point of this colonial state in the heart of the Muslim world is to make sure no pan-Islamism ever emerges. It's to make sure that Israel does what Israel in fact is doing. They are help the Ethiopians build a dam that weakens Egypt. They help the South Sudanese break off. When South Sudan declared independence, do you know they raised two flags? The South Sudanese flag and the Israeli flag.
Yeah.
That, I mean, the moment of independence. So now Egypt is a country like Egypt. Okay, you signed a peace treaty, but the Israelis are surrounding you from Ethiopia. Israelis are surrounding you from South Sudan. The involvement of Israelis with Haftar is another chapter that you could talk a lot about. And Israelis are in bed with the Kurds to make sure that Kurds and Arabs are divided. There is ample evidence that Israel plays a very active role in perpetuating the divide between Persians and Arabs. And you look at all of this and you tell me the Shia, who have been there all along since the very beginning of Islamic history, is a greater threat than this novel colonial state.
Or cancerous somehow. It's a metastasized growth that doesn't belong to the region.
I mean, it's at war with the only interest that Israel can accept from its Muslim neighbors is docility. Is basically, if you want to live, to make money, and be consumers, can you seriously imagine? I just want people listening to go through the mental exercise. Can you imagine Israel accepting any of its neighbors, whether it's Iran or Saudi Arabia or Jordan or Egypt or Morocco or Tunisia, not just immediate neighbors, even extensive neighbors? Can you imagine that Israel would accept that any of these countries would have an economy that is more powerful than Israel, or an industrial base that is more powerful than Israel? Do you think Israel would accept that?
Unlikely.
Not in a million years. Israel would do everything within its power to make sure none of its neighbors are ever in a position to challenge its power. Which tells you Israel is in a perpetual state of mistrust of its neighbors. Why? Because Israel knows very well that it is a bygone phenomena. What I mean by bygone phenomena is it is a settler colonial state that comes, removes an indigenous population, and brings in a population that replaces the indigenous population. That happened in the colonial age.
Right.
But in the modern world, after World War II, it was supposed that declaration everywhere was that this is not going to happen anymore, with one exception, Israel.
Right.
Where we are going to remove an indigenous population, we are going to bring a population from Europe, from Russia, from, the irony is, Netanyahu is a Russian Jew from the Eastern Bloc, basically. Begin was an Eastern Bloc. Sharon, Eastern Bloc. They're all basically Eastern Europeans that have come to this land. And we know that we have the support of the West as long as we are demonstrating to the West that we are useful to them. And how are we useful to them? By proving to the West that we are there as an antidote to any type of pan-Islamism that would emerge. Israel knows very well that if the West stops fearing pan-Islamism, if the West loses interest in pan-Islamism, then the West will lose interest in Israel. And so that can never be allowed to happen. So these are just realities. All that Muslims need to wake up to them and confront them. It is the height of delusion when you look at a country that has been in the region for centuries, as old as the region itself, like Iran, and you somehow tell yourself, oh, I will coexist with Israel, I will do the Abraham Accords with Israel, but I will remain in a hostile state with Iran. Iran has been there forever.
Right.
And it is part of your history. It is part of your identity. The lines between a Persian and Arab is actually blurred.
Totally.
I mean, and even the language is not what defines a Persian or an Arab. I mean, there are plenty of Arabs that speak Persian and plenty of Persians that are Arabic speakers.
Correct.
So that is the proof of the ongoing fingerprints of colonialism. You want to decolonize? You're serious about decolonizing? Revisit your historical thinking. Revisit the notion of the Ummah, that Allah tells you are about. What Allah wants is that you are an Ummah. And somehow you are telling Allah, yeah, that's nice, but that's too much. Let's not take it that seriously. I have other alliances and allegiances and that I'm going to worry about. When Allah says right there in the text of the Quran, وَأُولَٰئِكَ لَهُمْ عَذَابٌ عَظِيمٌ, and to those people, Allah reserves a great punishment. Allah is telling you, I will. I mean, I don't know, why don't we take Allah seriously? I really don't. When Allah says, I am going to seriously punish you for that type of thinking, and we say, oh, okay, but no, we don't really believe it. If I do my prayers and do fasting and praise zakat, I'll be fine. It's bizarre. It's truly bizarre. But the answer that I have is that we have colonized mentalities. When you look at colonized people, you find contradictions in their sense of identity and sense of awareness and sense of goals and purpose that do not make sense logically, but make sense sociologically.
As a final word, thank you so much for this. Many may have noticed that we didn't comment on the ceasefire in Gaza as the first stage took place last week. Chris Hedges recently commented on it, and he said something to the effect of, I'm not too thrilled necessarily. I'm glad that Palestinians are feeling some relief. However, it feels ominous given the fact that Israel has a track record of always getting into treaties and not fulfilling their end. As soon as their benefit is over, they return back to what they're doing, which mirrors the American approach to the genocide in North America, or Canada for that matter. Do you care to comment about it? Do you think that, like Hedges, that this was more a play that Trump wanted to win and didn't want the distaste?
I wish Muslims, I wish instead of giving silly Sunday classes that we give to students in our mosque, that we actually teach them history. Because that is the history of colonialism. If you study colonialism in the Congo, or you study colonialism in Egypt, or study colonialism in Algeria, or study colonialism wherever you study, that pattern of signing treaties with natives and indigenous people that you break and blame the indigenous party for breaking the treaty is hundreds of years old as colonialism. And why is that? Because the colonial power cannot afford to appear defeated. The whole colonial project is built on self-confidence. And if the indigenous defeats you, then the excitement around the colonial project starts evaporating, and the settler population that you want to come to replace the indigenous will go away. They'll say, we don't want to come. You didn't win a victory. So we don't want to settle. And so, and there is this awareness that, oh my God, that's a very serious danger. I have to appear like the indigenous basically are primitive people and I am civilized. I am the one who is always winning because these people are barely human. They're subhuman, in fact. And that's why signing any treaty with them doesn't last. So what is going to happen is that Israel can't afford Israel feels like it hasn't won a victory. Mm-hmm. And if you watch Israeli media, all the talk is about why didn't we destroy Hamas? Why didn't we win a victory? This is extremely dangerous. And the encounters with Hezbollah were indecisive, and Hezbollah kicked us out of Lebanon, and that's why we now will reoccupy parts of Lebanon and insist we're not going to leave. The logic is we get to do it again. We get to do it again because we want to send the message we're victorious.
Right.
And we need to send this message so that our settlers, the Americans and the Canadians and who are coming to basically replace the indigenous populations will come.
Right.
And will be all excited and high. Oh, because if the going gets tough, they're going to evaporate, and the colonial powers know that. Now, that's also why we have to be the fact that you have the parties that back up the resistance, whether you like it or not, they are challenging the colonial project. Mm-hmm. Whatever their motivations, but the fact that you are backing up that resistance, that Iran or Yemen or Syria, whatever, it basically is saying we don't want the colonial party to claim an absolute victory. And, it is not absurd to imagine that if there is no resistance, that 50 years from now, not even 100 years, but even far less than that Israel could be basically the superpower in the region, an absolute, unchallenged superpower that basically all the other countries in the region are basically client states of Israel. They have their so-called independence, but they get their orders from the Israeli capital. And if the patterns of colonialism hold, that's exactly what's going to happen. And that's why, the leaders of places like the Emirat and Saudi that are running away from pan-Islamism, which they see as a threat to their power, to basically throwing themselves in the arms of the colonizer and saying, okay, protect me. And I know that ultimately what this means is that I'm going to be taking my orders from you, but that's okay because I get to play ruler. I get to pretend that I am a sovereign. It is no path forward. And so there's that. Muslims that submit, they do their Islam is an Islam to nationalism, and Muslims who submit their Islam is the Islam of imitation, mindless imitations of the Salaf in outer appearances only, without an ideological understanding, a moral understanding. Both are sources of serious danger to the Ummah. Both the Salaf group and what are often referred to in Arabic as the Watanjiyya, the nationalist group. And we must reclaim the thought of the Ummah if we Muslims want to amount to anything in this world, because our history was always exactly that. Is that if Muslims, if you attack part of the Muslim world, you have antagonized the entire nest. You've disturbed the nest, which is the Muslim nest. The loss of that has basically meant exactly what you see now, and that is why the genocide in Gaza, Allah couldn't. I mean, it was, may Allah reward all the victims of that genocide. But the truth of the matter is that the genocide was a very clear message. Look at yourself. Look at where you are. You are in a state where 70 or more, much more, 1,000 people can be slaughtered. Hundreds of thousands can be displaced and starved, and you are entirely powerless to do anything. And those who dare do something, even as ineffective, Yemen, Lebanon, and so on, you are in such a bad state that the only thing you could do is to think about whether the Shia or Sunni. The heavens, I feel like the heavens is looking at us and say, shame on you. What state of Islam is this? You are talking about, you are somehow fulfilled or unfulfilled as Muslims. You are somehow you imagine yourself in good standing with God. You imagine yourself in that your dua is answered. You imagine yourself that Allah, shame on you. It's everything. It's like I said earlier in the khutbah, after Gaza, everything changes. Because I see Gaza as a very clear message. And any person today that I hear from, it's something, an expression like, Al-Furs Majus, the Persians are Majus, heathens.
Magi, yeah.
Or any time, immediately to me, my reaction is, you have betrayed the Muslim Ummah. You're a traitor. Because that statement is not your business. That statement is a betrayal of everything. It is the reason for the genocide, the reason for the suffering, the reason for all the horror that we are living through as Muslims.
Thank you so much, Sheikh. May Allah accept from you and from all of us, and may this be the beginning of a course correction that will set us straight, because I'm afraid to look into the future. Let's hope that we are wrong, and let's hope that we change this very soon, inshallah.
I don't see an alternative. We will just continue to suffer and deteriorate until what started out as a thought, an idea on the margins, becomes the accepted mainstream everywhere.
Thank you, and thank you all for being with us, and we hope to see you again soon.
Thank you, Shayan.
Assalamu alaikum.
Alaikum salam.